PyTorch literally powers the AI stack. Training, inference, orchestration, it's all there. AI stack now runs on PyTorch Foundation projects, whether it's PyTorch, vLLM, DeepSpeed, and Ray. But how do you keep open source AI moving fast while making it production ready for enterprises? That's what we are going to talk about with Mark Collier, Executive Director of PyTorch Foundation. Mark, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. I always enjoy catching up.
Yep.
Wherever we are in the world.
Wherever we are, it doesn't matter what path of journey we are on, we always meet.
We do.
Yeah, you, of course, you ran OpenStack and then OpenStack Foundation, which became Open Infra Foundation.
That's right, yes.
And which was also at the kind of beginning of private cloud. And
right.
I remember those conferences, massive conferences. But what was more exciting was that you folks have been at the edge of a new thing happening.
Right.
Now you are here at the PyTorch Foundation, Linux Foundation, once again, at the edge, AI. So talk a bit about either draw the parallel or kind of contrast OpenStack running Open Infra Foundation and now heading PyTorch Foundation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in common, which I think is primarily around making sure that as a new platform emerges and we have this kind of new era of computing, which, it seems like about once every 10, 15 years, like some new way of computing comes about, and cloud was that for us at that time. There's such a huge opportunity to collaborate openly and globally and build the software layers that can unlock kind of more opportunity for sovereignty, for choice, and actually just to move faster at solving hard problems. Because a lot of times some of these problems are so hard, you actually can't really solve them within one company in sort of a silo. So that's kind of, I would say, what they have in common. And if you look, more specifically at the PyTorch Foundation and the projects that we have, it's all about it kind of enabling support for this crazy pace of hardware innovation that's happening, right? And so I think this is the first time I've ever seen hardware and software both evolving and changing architecturally at the same time, and certainly at a rate we've never seen before, which comes back again to how are we possibly going to handle that without working together and collaborating and without open source.
That's so true. And if you look at AI, I think Jensen at NVIDIA has said there are 5 layers. Of course, we cannot do anything about the energy part. But when we look at the other 4 parts, whether it's hardware, framework, models, and other application on top of that, what role do you see of PyTorch Foundation? Because it started with one project, and now there are so many projects which are like solving different problems, whether inferencing, orchestration, training. So talk about the role, and then we will talk about, the deployment application there.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly we started the PyTorch Foundation, or others did before I joined, but it was started, around the PyTorch project, which has really become the de facto standard for how models get trained. So when you hear about these breakthroughs every day, a new model came out, whether it's a proprietary model from one of the big labs or all the open models that are coming out almost every single day, odds are it was trained using PyTorch. Almost all of them have been trained using PyTorch. So that's sort of like an essential open source tool in creating all this value. And even when you go into things like coding agents and these new models that can call tools and sort of work autonomously and long-running agents, like all that's made possible by PyTorch, because the model, which is really kind of the brain that we're creating the intelligence, it's created with that tool and in that ecosystem. And then as you kind of look at what happens after you train a model and you want to run the model, right? And you want to run it in production, so it kind of comes out of the R&D lab and goes into sort of the enterprise world, or the more of the real world where we want to get value out of it, or business value out of it. That's where you get to inference, and that's where vLLM comes in. So vLLM is by far the most popular tool for running these AI models in production, which is sort of the inference state. And one of the big differences there is with training. Of course, that gets a lot of the headlines because people are buying these massive data centers with the latest GPUs and spending, millions, billions of dollars. But if a training run fails, you'd usually just kind of restart it. Whereas when you're talking about inference, you're talking about production. And if it's like JP Morgan or some sort of serious enterprise use case, if your inference goes down, now your customers are offline, you're losing revenue. So in some ways, the inference challenge is even more difficult because there's a lot more at stake. And actually, Jonathan Bryce talked about this in his keynote, that we've had this flip where a few years ago, the training market was much bigger. And now by the end of this year, the inference market will be bigger. So it's not like one replaces the other, but as AI goes from kind of like a big promising thing that might be useful someday to something that's actually delivering real value this year, you see that kind of the importance of inference, and that's where vLLM comes in.
Perfect. What about the hardware part? Because you come from OpenStack background, I still remember your chaos monkey, you'll cut the cable in the middle of those. So you do have the background in the hardware. And this is also, I mean, NVIDIA GTC was last week. Hardware is, first of all, hard. That's where the hardware comes from. Limited, expensive. So what role can PyTorch Foundation play in that layer as well?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I mean, one of the things that is so interesting to me is that when you think about, you hear a new, Jensen gets on stage and launches, a new chip, a new architecture. What I hear when I see that is PyTorch, and vLLM for that matter, because any new chip, the path to market, like that very expensive, very hard to get GPU is actually, can't do any real work without PyTorch. PyTorch in some ways is the most essential open source project in the world when it comes to AI, because nobody will even think about shipping a new chip, whether it's, NVIDIA or all the competitors out there, the AMDs, the startups that are doing these kind of crazy inference chips. They wouldn't even think about trying to ship one of their new chips without having it fully tested on PyTorch. And so PyTorch, of course, is a moving target as well. It's constantly being updated. We just had a release last week. So every few months, there's a new PyTorch release. So you have this sort of co-evolution happening. And so it's very pertinent, your question about like, what is the role of kind of new hardware, and then where does the PyTorch Foundation come in? And actually, we're a critical component. Like you literally wouldn't want to ship any of these pieces of hardware without full support for PyTorch. And then when you think about the inference side, that kind of going to production and tokens in and tokens out, and how we integrate it deeply into real world use cases, that's the inference world, and that's where vLLM comes in. So we're actually doing inside the community, and something that our foundation helps coordinate, massive scale testing in terms of every commit that's coming in from the community. We have these CI systems. And so we take, new builds or new versions that are in development of PyTorch, and we test them against like the latest NVIDIA hardware, the latest, AMD hardware, and others that are part of our foundation. And that's why they're there, because they want to help us make this whole thing work, right? The hardware and the software have to work together. They're literally, kind of useless without that.
Exactly. Now, if we draw a parallel to the LAMP stack, or of course OpenStack or Kubernetes, all the layers are open source. AI is much more complicated.
Yes.
Now, there is a lot of risk. Fragmentation is of course there. Anthropic did a great job by open sourcing MCP last year and putting into Linux Foundation as well. Hardware lock-in is there. LLM lock-in is there. So to talk about, is there a world possible similar to the LAMP stack, where every layer is fully open source, and companies are doing the same thing that we have seen in past, whichever ecosystem is there? And I feel that Linux will still remain the foundational no matter where you go, right? So where do you think we are heading, or you think that may not be possible in the AI world?
Well, I mean, I think that today you already see, again, like PyTorch from the training side and vLLM from the inference side, playing that role of kind of the layer of abstraction between the workload or the work that you're trying to get done, whether it's a training run or if it's actually just running, applications that are hitting your inference server, and a variety of different hardware. And so that is where the layer that exists, and that is the role it plays. Now, it's not perfect, right? And so it's in a constant state of evolution. And another thing I would add that adds to the complexity, which is there's another form of architecture that's changing every day, which is the model architecture. So the models themselves, a lot of the innovation, which is really impressive and can sometimes lead to huge jumps in the intelligence of the model, or huge decreases in the cost or increase in speed and sort of like efficiency, some of those breakthroughs happen in days, and it's very eye-opening. So those algorithmic or sort of model architecture breakthroughs, they're impressive, but in order to ship them and use them, you actually have to have a new version of vLLM. So vLLM will often ship a new version on day 0 when a new model comes out. Now you see how fast these open weight models come out. There's almost one every day, but certainly within every 1 to 2 weeks, there's a new version of the software to enable that model because of these subtle but important changes that can lead to massive cost reduction or speed ups or, higher benchmark scores when it comes to some of these AI, evaluation platforms. So it's just, I think one last thing I'll just add is I think there's so much money going into this that there's a lot of pressure to turn around and get an ROI on that. And I think that historically in the tech industry, we've had this bad habit of sort of building a technology and then trying to find a market for it or find a problem it's supposed to solve. And I think there was some valid criticism of AI over the past couple of years. Are we doing it again? And I actually think this year with the sort of Claude Code Christmas or, Santa Claude, as I call it, when Claude Code came out around the Christmas time and Opus 4.5 and everybody started sort of trying this out and the capability had really gone to another level and we had a little bit more time to like play around with vibe coding or whatever, it actually turned the corner and now we're seeing truly economically viable output of something AI has been sort of hyping up for a couple of years. And I think that's a real turning point. So that this massive increase in investment, it's in search of a return, but the ways that we can collaborate openly can get us to that return more quickly, but it's got to work, right? It's got to work, which means all the testing, it's got to be, cost effective, and it's got to deliver an economically valuable result. And I think coding agents are the first really true market fit in terms of like, this is economically valuable and people want to just put the pedal to the metal.
When we look at PyTorch Foundation and, when you talk about solution looking for a problem, what kind of community, because there is no community, there are communities, right? What kind of communities there like vendors who are using this to put in production versus, of course, organizations collaborating to build the foundational. So can you also talk about the community that is around PyTorch Foundation, which could be either similar or different from the Open Infra, Linux Foundation, CNC, Linux community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very similar, going through a similar transition that we saw. So in the very early days of OpenStack, if you looked at who showed up, it was a lot of hardware companies, right? So, whether on the chip side, it was like the Intels of the world and the Dells and so forth. And then over time, you got more of the people that wanted to turn it into a product like a Red Hat and Canonical and things like that. So we're seeing kind of the same pattern happen, right? So today, if you look at, the companies that support the foundation and are investing heavily, it's the hardware innovators, right? It's the NVIDIAs, the AMDs, the ARMs, the, IBM, Intel, the list goes on and on. I mean, IBM's actually got some hardware that they're testing with it as well. But then we've also got Red Hat there and got some of the companies that are just starting to kind of become part of the foundation because they want to incorporate it into products and take it into the enterprise. And also, if you look at sort of our events, I think that's reflective of that as well. So we've historically had one PyTorch Con a year, and now we're going to 3 this year. So we're tripling the number of PyTorch conferences. So this year we're going to have one in about 2 weeks actually in Paris. Then we're going to the first one ever in Europe. Then we're going to do one in Shanghai, first one ever in China, and then we're back to Northern California, Silicon Valley for the big annual show in October. And if you look at, just kind of the makeup of the speakers and the attendees and the talks, it was pretty much hardcore research and kind of like R&D and academic if you go back 2 or 3 years. And now you see that's still a big part of it because we've got the innovators that are creating like new breakthroughs and algorithms, but you also have much more of kind of like financial services companies and the ecosystem of the Red Hats of the world saying, we're going to build products around this. So I think it's in that same arc, and we're just, in a different phase of it. But certainly I think people are starting to see where this is a business, it has to be part of their business. And this is the year where I think you'll see a lot of change in terms of who shows up at our events and who's part of the community. You were mentioning, the community or communities. And I think that is a really important point, is that to welcome people who are not necessarily wanting to be, merging code every day or consuming the upstream version that comes out every 2 weeks. They want something stable. They want to be able to run it in production. They want to be able to count on it for years and get support, and that's going to go through more of the commercial ecosystem side. So we're seeing that coming online now.
Excellent, thanks. And since you mentioned Paris, just tease us, what announcement are you folks planning for that?
Yeah, so, we were talking earlier about the projects that we support, and, last year, the PyTorch Foundation expanded into a multi-project foundation because it takes more to solve this a set of problems than just PyTorch, right? So vLLM, and we talked about some of those in Array and DeepSpeed. So one of the things we're excited about is we actually have 2 new projects that are now part of the PyTorch Foundation. So one of them is Helion, and this kind of speaks a little bit to making the technology more accessible. So Helion is kind of a layer of abstraction above Triton. So when you're trying to get down in close to the bare metal and the hardware and create these GPU kernels for GPUs, it's very, very technically difficult and, not particularly accessible unless you're really, really close to this space. And so Helion provides kind of another layer of abstraction so that you can, it's a DSL, so it's a way of sort of talking from a more accessible language that gets, kind of compiled down or translated down to Triton, which compiles down to actually the kernel. So it's a way of making it more accessible to kind of program and get value out of these expensive GPUs without having to be quite as deep of an expert. So that's Helion, and that's coming from Meta, who's been, doing a huge investment in this. They're the original founders of PyTorch, so they know a thing or two about this space. And then the other project's called Safe Tensors. And this is really about security. And this is coming from Hugging Face, which knows a lot about, open source AI. They're really the de facto standard out there for hosting these open weight models. And they do a great job of building and supporting community around that, encouraging that. And one of the things that is really important when you get into sort of sharing models and open models is what is the provenance of this, these weights, and when you download them. And historically, there was a format called Pickle, and that was kind of the precursor. And if you share your model in that format, it actually can allow arbitrary code to execute, which is really pretty much the worst thing you could say to a security researcher is, oh, our architecture allows arbitrary code to execute. So that turns them white or red or some shade, and they get very upset. So with Safe Tensors, it can actually validate that the weights that you're downloading, the model itself, is what it says it is, and sort of is not been tampered with, if you will. So that Safe Tensors format is really an emerging standard, and it's the perfect use case for open collaboration, because it's the type of thing where there are probably different ways to solve it, but it's more important that we just pick a way and work together, and then we can evolve it from there. We don't need 100 of those. So having one that a specific format that we're all kind of getting behind, and having the foundation stand behind that and give it a neutral home so that it can be counted on in a non-vendor, locked in sort of manner. It just makes a ton of sense for what we do at the foundation.
In today's world, you cannot talk about AI without talking about agents or agentic AI. And of course, last year, you folks also announced Agentic AI Foundation. How does agentic system fit into the PyTorch ecosystem?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're right, this is suddenly on everybody's mind, agents, right? And I think that, so I like to think about the AI world in general as kind of having 3 pillars, which are training, inference, and agents. And they're not separate domains, really, but they're, pillars. So they all kind of work together. And the reality is that when you have an agent, let's say, a coding agent or any sort of agent that you might be exploring, or long running agent, it is calling tools and connecting to data. But what it's connecting that to is models, and those models were trained by PyTorch. So when you can almost think of it simplistically as kind of when the agent needs a brain, and the brain is created by PyTorch. So PyTorch creates the brain, the intelligence, the kind of model. Inference is sort of taking all those brains and loading them on Kubernetes and running them in a data center, and then agent is just calling that and sort of connecting through and you know, in a loop and just utilizing this capability. But it's not like the model is gone or inference is gone. It's actually just built on top of each other or all interconnected. And so one of the things you see is in the world of model training is newer and newer models are built to do things that are better for agents. So the model itself is in many ways, it's the brains of the agent, to kind of, you know, just maybe double down on that analogy a bit. So they all sort of work together. And, you know, when you think about MCP, you know, that really fits into the standards bucket of like, okay, when these different things are being connected together, we need to do that in a way that the industry's all agreed upon, so that when we're connecting to real world systems and enterprise data and private data, that we have, you know, kind of a protocol to talk through, like HTTP or something like that. But the computing power and the model creation and the model serving, you know, that's all absolutely required to have an agentic system. So it's not, you know, the case that sort of any one of these things exists in isolation.
I'm into cars heavily, so I always draw analogy that, you know, those models are like V8 engine, and all those agents are more like, you can have Mustang, you can have Ford F-150, you can have anything else. So you can have those specialized use cases, but the brain, the engine is the same. And that's what you folks are building, the engines, they're V6, V8, V12, V18, whatever it is.
And the reality is the models and the inference architectures do need to change and evolve for the world of agents. So they don't go away, but they do evolve and they change. And it's actually, particularly when we think about production infrastructure at scale, it's a different world when the, you know, sort of user of your application is not a person, it's an agent. And there are all kinds of corner cases and you know, things that are being discovered as we go along of what that actually means when you're effectively, you know, building, and even some of the products now that are being built, they're being built or services or even, you know, websites, they're being built with the idea in mind that the end user is an agent. And that's kind of a mind-bending thing. And it changes how we think about security and user experience. And, you know, there was a keynote I saw this morning talking about AX, or agent experience, sort of like the new DX or UX. So, you know, designing a system knowing that a computer is going to be the consumer of it on behalf somewhere down the line of a human, presumably. It's a different mindset, and it affects every layer of the stack all the way back to the model.
As the executive director of PyTorch Foundation, what is your vision? What is your goal? Let's not talk long term, because we have seen things change so fast in the AI world. But what is your goal for 2026?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really to take this responsibility very seriously. We have to think about how we're really co-designing, co-developing, really co-evolving this stack, both hardware and software. Obviously, we focus on the software side, but the hardware is right there with us, and we're evolving together. And think really beyond single project, right? So as a foundation, we're no longer a single project foundation. That's because the world it's never really been a single project world, but there can be, you can have blinders on if you get too caught up in just thinking about your little domain. You need to have domain expertise and people that are solving a subset of the problems without being too distracted by the bigger whole. But you can't lose track of that whole. And we got to be thinking about this bigger picture of what are all the open source components that exist or need to exist. And so there's kind of like three ways to think about it. One is the existing projects within the PyTorch Foundation. How do they need to evolve for the new use cases, for agents, things like that? There's what projects do we need to add? And we're adding a couple of new projects to the foundation, you know, right now. And then also what projects maybe won't ever be part of this foundation, but they're part of the wider ecosystem, the world, they're part of the solution. How do we collaborate with them? Maybe they're part of other foundations. And I had some discussions, you know, at KubeCon about this, right? Of like, how does Kubernetes fit in with PyTorch and things like that. So just thinking about like how much responsibility we have to really deliver open source AI across training, inference, and agents, and understand we have to work together on it, and globally too, not just across foundations or projects, but across the planet. And, you know, I've been saying that a long time, but I feel like it's more important than ever that we, recommit to that.
Excellent, Mark. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, and of course, great insights where the foundation is heading. And hopefully, we will build the same stack that we built with the LAMP stack. Every layer is open source, and with your leadership, we do hope that. So, thank you for your time, and I look forward to chatting with you again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.